Hello and welcome to your lecture on the end of the Cold War and Chernobyl. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in the blanks. The Cold War, that intense rivalry between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, endured for 44 long years from 1947 to 1991. Like all things under the sun, it eventually had to come to an end. And this is how it happened. In the year 1985, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev became premier of the Soviet Union. Premier is sort of like president. And from 1985 to 1991, Gorbachev led and reformed the Soviet Union. Here's a picture of him. When Gorbachev became premier in 1985, the USSR was in trouble. The arms and space races, along with the failed war in Afghanistan, have been extremely expensive, and this at a time when the economy was stagnant. The USSR had no money, and no money means unhappy people, even if they aren't allowed to voice their opinion. Gorbachev knew that if he were to be a successful premier, he would have to act quickly, and so he worked to improve the economy and to thaw tensions with the United States. He approached then US President Ronald Reagan, and while the two remained rivals, they also developed a sort of friendship. Together, they signed deals to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. This was great for two reasons. First, because it reduced the threat of total nuclear annihilation, always a bonus. Second, because with the nuclear arms race slowing down, fewer weapons had to be produced. That meant less money had to be spent. That is the first step toward getting the USSR back on its feet, Gorbachev thought, but now it was time to turn his attention to the home front. And here's where we get to the two policies for which Gorbachev is most famous: Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost means political openness. And political openness, in terms of Glasnost, meant a freer press and the ability to criticize the government. Up until this point, the press, that is, newspapers and television stations and radio stations, had not been free. The only things they were allowed to report on were what the government told them to report on. The only information they were allowed to give to the public was the information the government told them to give. However, under Gorbachev, you see that start to change. All of a sudden, the newspapers and the radio stations and the television stations are able to report on issues that the government didn't necessarily tell them to report on. And they're able to give information that the government didn't necessarily want the citizens to know. At the same time, there is more ability, more freedom to criticize the government. Before this, if you had said something that the government didn't really want you to say, you could lose your job or be thrown in jail, or even, especially in the earlier years of the USSR, be sent to a gulag, which is like a concentration camp. However, under Gorbachev, people gained a lot more freedom to criticize the government. On the one side, this is fantastic. If you want to have a free society, you have to have freedom of the press. You have to have freedom of speech. However, remember, when Gorbachev becomes premier, there are a lot of unhappy people in the USSR. And so when they become freer, when they gain this freedom to voice their opinion, as you can imagine, there are a lot of negative opinions flying about. And this will cause Gorbachev a little bit of trouble down the road. The second main reform for which Gorbachev is famous is perestroika, or political reform. Under this socialist system in the USSR, the central government had pretty much all the power. They would tell local governments what they should do. They would tell farmers what they should grow. They would tell businesses what they should make and how much to charge for it. When you had an election, you often just had one person running, and you could choose to vote for that person. However, under perestroika, that begins to change. First, you have multi-candidate elections. Multi means many. In other words, when you have an election for a political office, you can have more than one person run. Imagine that up until this point, when you've had someone run for mayor, say, you get one choice. Joe Schmo is running for mayor. Are you going to vote for him? How much choice do you have? But all of a sudden, because you have multi-candidate elections, you can choose between Joe Schmo and Amy Schmo and Reginald Schmo. And you know what? They might even have different opinions from one another. Can you see what freedom that gives people? All of a sudden, their vote means something. Multi-candidate elections gives people more of a voice and more of a choice. A second reform under perestroika was that the central government started giving more power to local governments. This is a big change, and it gives people a lot more power to tailor what's going on to their individual area. So far you have multi-candidate elections, you have giving local governments more power. The third change gives farmers and businesses more of a say in what they produce, how much of it they produce, and what they choose to charge for it. So remember, up until this point in time, if the central government of the USSR wanted more wheat to be produced, they would go to the farmers and say, okay, you're going to make more wheat, you're going to grow wheat, and here's how much of it you're going to grow, and here's what you're going to charge for it once it's grown. But under these reforms, all of a sudden, farmers have more choice. Maybe they want to grow wheat, maybe they want to grow barley. They have more of a choice, and they can choose maybe how much of it they want to grow and how much they want to charge for it. And same with businesses. Now, just for the record, they are not given total control over what they're growing and how much of they're growing and what they're charging for it, but they are being given some control, which is a lot more than they had before. Having multi-candidate elections, giving local governments more power, enabling farmers and businesses to make their own decisions. These are all reforms that are essential, again, to a free society, but like the reforms associated with glasnost, that openness, these reforms also have a destabilizing effect in the USSR. That is, there's some growing pains. It's hard to go from a system where wheat, for example, is always at this price and they're never going to charge more for it, to a system where maybe the farmer says, well, you know what, actually it costs a bit more than that to grow. I'm going to charge a little bit more. There are rises in food prices, and people are a little bit unsure of how all this is going to work out. Again, this causes some trouble for Gorbachev down the road. In 1989, the ripple effects of these policies become felt very strongly in some of the satellite countries of the USSR. Remember, the USSR isn't just Russia. It's Russia and her territories, Russia, plus all the other countries that she's managed to fold under her wing. And in 1989, some of those countries are ready to escape the nest. These freer elections enable countries to elect politicians that want more democratic governments. And several of the countries under the USSR, countries like Bulgaria, countries like Poland, decide that it's time to check out the socialist government, put in a democratic government, and say, see ya, to the Soviet Union. In other words, they want to break away and become independent nations. In older times, such a brash move would have been met by troops from the USSR that would march in and quash the rebellion and say, sorry, country, you're staying with the USSR whether you like it or not. Not under Gorbachev. When these countries start to break away from the USSR, Gorbachev makes the decision to not send in troops. He lets them go. In 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. The Berlin Wall was a wall dividing West Berlin from East Berlin. And to understand why that's important, you have to take a look all the way back to the end of World War II. Do you remember how at the end of World War II, the United States and the USSR decided to divide Korea into two halves, and North Korea would belong to the USSR and South Korea would belong to the US, and both of them set up governments there, etc.? Korea was not the only place where that happened. It also happened in Germany. At the end of World War II, Germany is divided between the USSR and Britain, France, and the US. The portion of Germany that was given to Britain, France, and the US becomes West Germany. It has a democratic government of its own. And the portion of Germany that goes to the USSR is socialist under the USSR, and it sets up its own government. However, the capital city of Berlin falls smack into USSR occupied territory. And the Western powers don't really like that. So just as they divided Germany into two halves, so the Western powers and the USSR divide Berlin into two halves, with one half being part of West Germany and having a democratic government, and the other half being part of East Germany and having a socialist government ruled by the Communist Party. A wall was built to divide the two halves, but in 1989, thanks in part to a misinterpreted lessening of travel restrictions, people flooded the checkpoints at the Berlin Wall and ended up dancing on top of the wall and breaking it down with sledgehammers. Here's a picture. Here is the Berlin Wall while it was standing. You can see some lovely barbed wire atop it. And here are people breaking it down, breaking down borders. Pretty soon, all of Germany is unified under a democratic government. Think back to all the reforms I have described. You have a freer press, a greater ability to criticize the government, multi-candidate elections with people with different opinions, more power to local governments, more control to farmers and businesses to choose what they want to make and what to charge for it. You have countries breaking away from the Soviet Union with no repercussions. You have the Berlin Wall falling down. It was only a matter of time. In 1991, thanks to the instability caused by Gorbachev's reforms, the USSR collapses as surely as the Berlin Wall did. Now, instead of the USSR, we have Russia and 11 other countries. With the collapse of the USSR came the collapse of the Cold War. Without the USSR, there was no need to continue a Cold War, and so it ended in 1991. There was one event which we have not yet discussed, which Gorbachev said caused the fall of the USSR more than pretty much any other. It happened in 1986, and it was called Chernobyl, otherwise known as the worst nuclear disaster in the history of the world. Chernobyl was a nuclear power plant located in the country of Ukraine, which at that point was part of the USSR, near the city of Pripyat. Here is a map for you. As you can see, the country of Ukraine is nestled between Russia, Belarus, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. The enormous nuclear power plant at Chernobyl was built near the border of Belarus, within spitting distance of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. And although it's not shown on this map, nearby was a model Soviet town named Pripyat. It was built for the workers at Chernobyl to live in, and it was a great place to live. It even had a fairgrounds. Everything was going wonderfully until everything went terribly, terribly wrong. In the wee hours of April 26, 1986, a safety test at Chernobyl went horribly awry, and radioactive material, more than 400 times that emitted at Hiroshima, began spewing into the air. Here's a picture of the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl before the terrible explosions and after. I say explosions, there were multiple. They blew the 1,200-ton roof right off. Here's a closer picture. You can see the devastation. And like I said, radioactive material is spewing into the atmosphere. You would think that the government of the USSR would tell everyone right away, right? So they could take the measures that need to be taken and get out of there. Wrong. Despite the policy of glasnost, the old habits of secrecy died hard. The USSR didn't want to tell anyone about the accident or about the radiation, and that secrecy would lead to much more severe radiation poisoning than might otherwise have happened. Take the sad case of the first responders, for example, the firefighters, the police. They weren't told about all the radiation being spewed out of that reactor, and when they went in to fight those fires, they were wearing very little or no protective clothing. Take the sad case of the residents of Pripyat and its surrounding areas. They were not notified of what was going on until 36 hours after the terrible accident. During those 36 hours where they didn't know anything was going wrong, they went about their normal lives, going to the beach, going to the store, going out in the streets, and being exposed to very high levels of radiation. On top of that, the USSR was loath to tell other countries what had happened, even though weather patterns were already shifting those clouds of radiation over all of Europe. In fact, the USSR didn't admit what had happened until researchers in Sweden noticed unusually high radiation levels in their air and traced it back to the USSR and said, hey, there's lots of radiation over here in Sweden. Are you causing it? What happened? Here is a map of the European countries affected by radioactive fallout from the Chernobyl disaster. The areas of darkest red are the most severely affected, lighter red a bit less, and the palest areas escaped relatively unscathed. As you can see, the effects of the Chernobyl disaster were much more widespread than just the plant itself. Radiation spread across Scandinavia, across Eastern Europe, and even into Western Europe. Radiation poisoning was not just caused by radiation in the air, it was caused by contaminated food. When radiation gets into the soil and it gets into the water, it becomes very dangerous because plants absorb that radiation. And if you eat a plant that has been growing in soil with high radiation levels, you can get radiation poisoning. But it goes beyond that, because if an animal eats that plant that's been in radioactive soil, the meat of that animal will also be contaminated. So people who are eating plants that had high radiation levels or animals that have been eating those plants could get radiation poisoning. Now, the USSR did set standards for how much radiation was allowable in various different kinds of food. How much radiation is okay in beef? How much in chicken? How much in mushrooms? They set those levels for the most part. But the problem was that they weren't that well enforced, or in some cases, they were fudged. Take blueberries, for example. When sorting through blueberries, each blueberry had to be measured to see how much radiation it was emitting. And so you have the berries that are dirty, that have higher radiation levels, and you have berries that are clean, that have very low or no radiation levels. Oftentimes, people who are sorting through these blueberries would mix the really dirty berries with the clean berries into one package so that the overall radiation level of the package met the acceptable level, even though there were some really radioactive berries in those packages. As long as all the blueberries all together made an okay level of radiation, they would still pack them and ship them off to the market. And in this way, people across the USSR were poisoned. The effects of the Chernobyl disaster are still around today. There is an exclusion zone, 30-kilometer exclusion zone around the Chernobyl power plant. 30 kilometers each side, it makes up about 1,000 square miles. And for the most part, with few exceptions, people are forbidden from living in the exclusion zone. This is an entire area of the country where people are no longer allowed to live. One of the benefits of this is that it's become one of the best nature preserves in all of Europe. There are elk and wild horses living in this exclusion zone. You can see that nature has started to reclaim the city of Pripyat. You have grass and trees growing right in city centers. But as idyllic as this all looks, it's important to remember that the area inside this exclusion zone is not going to be habitable for upwards of 20,000 years. People are still feeling the effects of radiation poisoning. We still have cases of people developing cancer. Remember, 600,000 liquidators were involved in the cleanup itself, not to mention all of the people who were evacuated and all the people in neighboring countries and towns who received radiation poisoning. So it is still an issue today. And we don't know exactly how widespread the problem is. Official death tolls say that 54 people died and that another 4,000 might have died from radiation poisoning since then. But these are really minimum estimates. Unofficial estimates go as high as 93,000 people dead. Part of the problem is that it's difficult to measure how many people have died because cancer caused by radiation looks basically just like any other cancer. And even though there have been rising cancer rates in a lot of these areas, people aren't always sure if those rising cancer rates are because there's actually more cancer or just because the cancer is better reported now than it was during the early 1980s. The political effects of the Chernobyl disaster were also enormous. It convinced people across the world that nuclear power was a bad idea. Even today, Chernobyl is brought up as an example of why we should not use nuclear energy at all. It's simply too dangerous. Anger and distrust at the government over its handling of the Chernobyl disaster, or rather, mishandling of the disaster at Chernobyl, helped lead to the fall of the USSR. Remember, all of a sudden, you have newspapers and television stations and radio stations reporting on the Chernobyl disaster, giving information the government doesn't necessarily want the people to have, letting people voice their opinions, even when those opinions are against the government. People are angry, people feel like they can't trust the government anymore, and people are not afraid to say it. So the anger and distress caused by the Chernobyl disaster, rightfully caused, I would say, helped lead to the fall of the USSR. The fall of the USSR and the end of the Cold War marked the end of an era. Next week, we'll discuss a new movement, one no less powerful, but a lot more positive. See you next week.